Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you guys so much for coming out, even with the weather. My name is Cherie Hannouche, and I work in the education team in large customer sales for GBO. And I am thrilled today to introduce two-time Pulitzer Prize winner Nicholas Kristof and award-winning producer and head of Show of Force Mira Chang. Today we're going to talk a little bit about their newest documentary, Path Appears, Transforming Lives and Creating Opportunity, which is based on the book of the same title that Nicholas wrote with his wife, Alfre Woodard. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the documentary. We're going to play a quick clip and then bring them up. The actual documentary follows advocates and actors, including Malin Akerman, Blake Lively, Jennifer Garner, Mia Farrow, Alfre Woodard, as they traveled to Kenya, Colombia, Haiti, as well as the United States. And they uncovered different parts of human rights violations and the effective solutions being implemented to combat them. Nicholas Kristof is an award-winning journalist, a recognized humanitarian, a best-selling author, and a New York Times columnist. In 1990, he won a Pulitzer with his wife, Alfre Woodard, for their coverage of China's Tiananmen Square. He won a second Pulitzer in 2006 for his columns on the genocide in Darfur that are said to have single-handedly focused Americans on the attention and atrocities committed during that time. Nicholas has been credited for reshaping the field of opinion journalism and for being, and I quote, the conscience of international journalism. Through his writings and initiatives, he's done a lot to shine a light on gender oppression, human rights violations, and social and economic justice around the world, and call on us to do our share to make the world a better place. Meera Cheng is a producer, director, and director of photography of nonfiction content for domestic and international television, and several full-length documentaries as well. Her work can be seen regularly on ABC, National Geographic, A&E, and Discovery. And she's been nominated for several Emmys as well as Academy Awards. Meera also produced the landmark 4-hour PBS documentary, Half the Sky, Turning Oppression into Opportunity for Women Worldwide, which was based on the best-selling book with the same title that Nicholas and his wife wrote. She's currently heading up the development at Show of Force, and we've got some of them here with us today, so welcome. And that they are the creative enterprise behind 2 PBS documentaries with Kristof and a number of Emmy-winning projects as well. So I'm going to just show a quick clip of the trailer of the 3-part series, which is airing tonight on PBS as well as next Monday.
Our new project is called A Path Appears. The title is from Lu Xun, a prominent Chinese writer, who said that hope is like a path in the countryside. At first, there is no path, but as more and more people walk again and again, a path appears. Meaning a solution appears. It's about innovative strategies for making a difference. In Half the Sky, we were asking, how do you begin to tackle seemingly insurmountable problems?
Is that red door, is that a brothel, do we think?
Yes, it is. She doesn't have a radial pulse. Stay safe, okay?
In A Path Appears, we take it to a new level. We actually look at the roots of vulnerability, and we talk about solutions that really address those roots.
It's easier to look at problems outside the country than it is to look at stuff in our own backyard.
More than 300,000 girls go missing each year.
In the United States?
In the U.S., and 100,000 of them are sold for sex in some form.
Nick and Cheryl use stories to capture attention.
That's the signal.
Police, you're under arrest, okay?
That's not the reality. This is the reality.
Like every day.
Because stories are powerful.
That's her.
That's her?
That's Naomi.
From Haiti to Chicago, from Colombia to Kenya to Boston, the central problem as we see it is poverty.
This trailer is a home where they said they may have 14 people at a time.
Yes.
Poverty is much more than just not having enough money. It's not having hope.
From sex trafficking to teen pregnancy to unemployment to substance abuse to violence against women. Cheryl and I are traveling to new parts of the world.
It's overwhelming. I don't know if I've seen this much despair before. You're lucky if you're just struggling. The vast majority are just alive.
At any given moment, it could turn ugly and violent.
Cheryl and I are sharing real human stories of struggle, challenge, and transformation.
I am tired, hear me? Are you tired?
Yeah.
Are you ready to go today?
No.
None of these problems exist in isolation.
She had 14 kids, and those babies are gonna grow up poor, and they're gonna remain in the cycle of poverty forever.
We now understand how a tiny intervention can have a transformative impact on a child's life a generation later.
Oh, wow. Yes.
As we take our journey, we're going to be inviting along actors to try to highlight not just the problems, but the ways to chip away at them.
Hi, I'm Ashley. I'm a grateful, recovering, depressed, codependent, survivor of all forms of sexual abuse, including incest and rape, and about that, I have no shame.
Welcome to the circle.
I feel like I've discovered this darkness that lives in our country. This isn't falling through the cracks. This is an earthquake.
It's important to keep bearing witness, keep telling the story.
Más adelante y sí se puede hacer todo que quieres en tu corazón, ¿vale? Y tú vas a hacer, ¿no? Sí. Sí. Oh. Gracias.
Our world is now a global village.
When we look at these monumental problems, they seem so daunting, but we can change the course of history. We can set these young children onto a much more promising path.
One girl at a time.
Yeah. It all goes back to early childhood intervention in this country and, of course, around the world.
What you have to do is dream about the future and have hope for the future, and that's how the future changes.
I know I can save you. Just say something. Just open your mouth and tell me so that I can fix it. You know.
There is a solution. It takes the parents, it takes the teachers, it takes the whole community. It's just up to us to care.
I definitely walk away feeling hopeful. I think that we are capable of great things.
Everyone, everywhere, can have an impact in humanity. Through hope, we can achieve our dreams.
Everyone, please welcome Nicholas Kristof and Mira Chang.
Thanks a lot.
So much.
Hi,
thank you very much. Hi, thank you.
Just take your seat.
Yep, hey.
Oh, sorry.
It's totally fine. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
That's great.
Thank you all for bringing this incredibly well-smelling food, too.
Lunch hour, perfect timing, right? Guys, can you tell us just a little bit more about A Path Appears? Both the book and the documentary explore gender inequality. Where does the actual title come from?
So let me tell you about sort of the origins of the book. After Cheryl and I wrote, and Cheryl sends her regrets. She, I hate to admit this in a discussion of gender equality, but she's actually at home, probably right now, shoveling our driveway. So I got the better end of the stick right here. And so she sends her regards. She would much rather, I think, be here as well. But after we wrote Half the Sky, and after the Half the Sky documentary that Mira had also worked on, then that had really focused on empowering women abroad. And after that, we got a couple of kinds of questions. One, what about the situation right here in the US? And secondly, so what can I do? What are the solutions? And we wanted to come back and look at ways one can make a difference. It does seem to us that, you know, that by and large, people do want to find a little more purpose in life, make a difference, especially millennials, for that matter, and that there really is evidence now about what works, what doesn't work, and that there are sometimes it becomes kind of a little bit too easy to point to problems abroad when we also have huge problems right here. And it's too easy to kind of pit them against each other and say either we should solve our own problems first before worrying about Tanzania, or to say, to say the opposite, that we should just focus on problems abroad. There are huge problems both here and abroad, and we wanted to offer some windows into how to address them.
And a lot of those problems, I mean, people just don't see. When we were talking about Half the Sky and we were talking about maternal mortality and trafficking, violence against women, people don't even know the extent of what happens here in the US. And even back when Half the Sky was being produced, we kept thinking about, it would be amazing to be able to shed light on what's happening here in our country, because I don't think it's really discussed a lot. So that was one of our hopes for A Path Appears as well. And hopefully people walk away with that.
I like also the different ways that you're also reaching those audiences. You mentioned millennials, and I think, of course, millennials do get this bad rap of being lazy or not as involved. And yet, even in 2014, there were reports from the Millennial Path Report that talked about how the high percentages of millennials who have given back and who have volunteered their time and who have made contributions. What are some of the ways that we can kind of communicate to millennials to encourage them to give back?
So there is a pathappears.org website that does list some ways of engaging, and likewise in the back of the book there are a bunch of great organizations, as well as a list of things you can do in the next 10 minutes, for example. And what you choose, there's no one right answer about what to do. It depends a little bit what you care about, what your passions are. Broadly, there are three kinds of things. You can donate, you can volunteer, or you can engage in advocacy. On the issue of millennials, though, I think one of the things that corporate America hasn't kind of woken up to is that corporations really can do, I think, a much better job with corporate social responsibility programs. And so far, CSR has been kind of a joke, really window dressing largely. And it would be great if the tech sector showed some real leadership here, partly because so many of the employees are millennials, because companies tend to emphasize values, have brands they care about, and in fact, the tech sector has underperformed, I'd say, in CSR.
And it's interesting because at Google, I think we are very fortunate that we have different ways to give back. Our Google Serve, which is a week dedicated to giving back, as well as a Google Match program. But as you mentioned, not all tech companies kind of have that on par, and that has been very important for millennials. They really do care about the type of organization that they work for and what they stand for. What are some ways, can you talk a little bit more about some ways that in Silicon Valley or tech companies can stand up?
Well, I think that a CSR program that actually involved employees, gave them a choice, gave them a vote. Do you want to, adopt this cause or that cause? Gave them a chance to volunteer, in East Palo Alto, where almost, I don't know what proportion of kids are below the poverty line, but is right next door to so many very successful companies. And on some of the issues that we talk about in the documentary or in the book, sex trafficking, it would be incredibly powerful if there were tools addressed to, these kids are advertised on the web. And I think that reflects kind of an acquiescence on our part that these girls don't matter. We would not allow, fully automatic machine guns or RPGs to be sold on the web, or large quantities of meth. Silk Road is now, they're closed down for that reason. But we do allow 100,000 girls each year, approximately, to be sold, underage girls, to be sold on the web on organizations like Backpage. I think it's a function of priority. So I'd love to see companies get involved to try to provide tools to address this, provide volunteer opportunities, and ways of engaging employees in such that would, I think, boost the brand and boost morale and create I think, it used to be that the way we engage was we would write checks at the end of the year. I think that more and more for your generation, you're trying to make a difference not just by writing checks, but in the consumer decisions you're making. what you buy, in the company that you work for, in the investments you make. And I don't think the corporate sector has fully woken up to the benefits from really engaging in ways that would help recruitment and retention and actually be in their own self-interest as well.
I think one of the things on that, because the 3-part series, it actually aired the first part last Monday, and we had a small Google session of people who kind of talked about the first part the next day at breakfast. And one of the things that actually surprised me was how many people shared the same sentiments of some of the advocates and actors in the piece of not knowing that this is happening in your backyard in the U.S., Boston, Nashville, right there. I think that's one of the things that...
Or Times Square, if we're right here.
Exactly, exactly. What are some of the things that you think, what are some of the reasons you think that that's not being shared or broadcasted as much and people are thinking it's happening in India or very far away?
I think there are two misunderstandings that we have about sex trafficking in the U.S. One is we tend to think it involves foreign women being smuggled into the U.S., and that's real. That happens, especially both with Asians and with Latinas in particular. But the bigger part of the problem, and especially involving underage girls, is homegrown American girls. And this is it obviously involves all kinds of girls, but often it's girls who have grown up in disadvantaged communities. They may have endured sexual abuse at a very young age. They may have self-esteem issues. And then typically, they have maybe a tough relationship with their mom. Then the mom's boyfriend is hitting on them. They run away at age 13 to, say, the Port Authority. And who's looking for them there? It's the pimps. And so 100,000 underage kids a year in the U.S. Well, 1.6 million are run away each year in the U.S. And of those, about 100,000 are trafficked into the sex trade. And that, I think the other misunderstanding we have is we see a 15-year-old girl out on the street. She's wearing inappropriate clothing. Nobody's holding a gun to her head. We assume that she is there, because she wants to be. And it is so much more complicated than that. Yeah. And it's true that it's not as if she is physically being handcuffed to a radiator and locked up in a closet somewhere. That happens, but that's much less common. But the kinds of control and coercion and intimidation and violence that control these teenage girls are very real and make it far from this sort of happy, voluntary situation that we tend to impute to it. Yeah,
no, I think that a lot of it is changing for the better in terms of awareness, but there's still a long way to go. I think maybe 10 years ago I did a documentary about teen prostitutes, where today we would call it trafficking, So I think a lot of it is that there's some, perception from the public that the idea of prostitution has a lot of choice involved in it. But when you speak to trafficking survivors or prostitutes who've been arrested like 160 times, it always goes back, if you peel back the layers, to some really common roots about, difficult home lives and a great deal of abuse, sexual and otherwise, from an early age. So we have to start thinking about it differently and also understanding that there's not one thing to do. We worked a lot with law enforcement, and all of them are trying to figure out now how to approach it, and they realize it's not just one thing. They need to work with survivors. They need to work with the justice system, and they need to treat the demand side differently. So, yeah, so I think things are changing, but it's a lot about awareness, and understanding that these issues are taking place and how you could, just by understanding it in a different way, help move it a bit.
Yeah, it seems like awareness is key, but then also, as you mentioned, those complications, that it's not, something that you might see on the street, what's actually really there. And in the documentary from last Monday, there was one scene that we'd love to just show a clip of that just really painted a very clear picture of what's happening. And it tells the story of a young girl named Savannah. So just want to show that clip real quick.
sitting down and talking to me too.
Sure.
I really appreciate it.
Savannah's just got back home. She was in a group home for a while. Well,
I was in a hospital for 9 months and then a group home for like 3.
When we have visits, this is kind of what we do. We'll meet at like a coffee shop.
Savannah is a 17-year-old girl who turned out to have been trafficked when she was just 13 and who ultimately was locked up in a house by a pimp and truly enslaved in any sense of that word.
So one day, I think I was 13. I didn't really know a lot about anything. So I went online and I wanted to, I don't know how I came across like this website for like, you know, like sugar daddies, guys would pay for your stuff and you would have sex with them. I didn't know that I would have to have sex with them. I just thought they were gonna, I don't know what I was thinking, but I just thought that, you know, they would buy me stuff and just because I was pretty, I don't know. But yeah, he took me shopping and then we went and I still did not understand what was happening, like completely, even when we went to the hotel room until it happened. And then I was still a virgin, but that was my first time with an old guy, and he said he was taking some pictures. And I knew what kind of pictures they would be, like I thought, but I didn't really know that they would be put online and I would be doing all this other stuff.
Society's idea of what a woman is that sells her body. You think of this woman who's like hardened and callous and she doesn't care. But when you think of that, you don't think of someone like Savannah, who has done all of those things that we think of a prostitute as doing. You don't ever think of someone being vulnerable and being broken and wanting to get out of that life and wanting to be a little girl again. You don't think of them as little girls.
He hit me a few times, and then he had a gun and he pointed it at me and he was like, "You need to do what I say." He was like, "I will kill you." He thought that the moment he put the gun to my head, like he had me, that I wasn't gonna leave.
To see Savannah was to see the face of the reality of what it is in our country. And that was the most profound thing for me.
You think about your partner, who you love and love having sex with. You think about having to have sex with that person that you love and adore 10 to 20 times a day. Now think about survivors and kids in life. They have to sleep with 10 to 20 strangers per night. Who would ever choose to do something like that?
I think, you know, when we look at that, that in itself shows some of the differences of those subtleties and complexities we see happening in the US versus some of the other parts of the world. But the documentary does explore Kenya and Haiti and Colombia. What are some of the differences, you know, when we're looking at those global issues and sort of gender inequalities between the different places?
You know, there's no doubt that poverty in America starts at a material level and an education level that is much greater. So there are plenty of people who are poor in America who have a vehicle, who have a home that is more than just a shack, that has electricity, this kind of thing. They're probably going to go to school at least until high school. While in much of the rest of the world, they may be completely illiterate, have no electricity, this kind of thing. But there is a commonality, and I think that too often we tend to measure poverty with metrics of income or wealth. You know, in many ways, the best metric of poverty is something like hopelessness, or maybe it's whether you have books in the home, whether you're ever read to, whether there's any affection in the home as you're growing up. And there are an awful lot of kids growing up in America that, by that measure, are as poor as any in the world. There are all kinds of pathologies that come with poverty that make it a lot harder to address than just a money issue. And it was heartbreaking reporting on some of these things. There was one, in the opening clip you saw, there was one little boy, a 4-year-old boy named Johnny. He can't speak. Why can't he speak? Because he had a hearing problem early on in life, probably from untreated ear infections. And they weren't caught. He didn't get a hearing screening. And so as his brain is developing, he's not getting any auditory input, so that he doesn't develop speech. And finally it's caught later on by Save the Children. Thank God they were there to do it. And we still don't know whether he will ever fully be able to recover. And the idea that, that this happens, that a kid like Johnny can fall through the cracks in this country through something as simple as missing a hearing screening, is just shattering when you see a little kid like that. And I hope that one thing that viewers will get from A Path Appears when they see him is, we have this narrative in this country about how poverty is about personal irresponsibility. There's no doubt that that is sometimes true, that there are certainly some poor people who were irresponsible, and there is self-destructive behavior that sometimes goes with poverty, but not always. And you get a 4-year-old kid who has done nothing wrong, and yet he is going to be disadvantaged, perhaps for the rest of his life, because we dropped the ball. We as a society dropped the ball on providing hearing screenings, and that's a irresponsibility that is not Johnny's, it's ours.
I think, that story, and obviously Savannah's story as well, are so shattering and they are so overwhelming that a lot of times, people wonder, what can I do? How can I actually make a real difference? And you mentioned before there are many different levels where people can actually effectively participate and join the conversation. And what I love about the documentary, but also the book, is that there are clear stats that you have which speak to what people can actually do. One that just I keep with me every day, is that if everyone just gave up their morning coffee, 220 billion would go back into these issues. I think I'd love to hear from you guys, and I'm sure the audience as well, just other stats or things that are really eye-opening that can talk to certain change that we can make.
You should talk to that from the book.
Some of the stats that really struck me are just about the cost effectiveness of addressing some of these issues. We tend to think that it's hopeless, and I think that's one reason why we tune out. And maybe one problem of us as journalists and also the humanitarian community is we focus so much on the problems that we lead people to think that all there are is problems, that there isn't progress. There has been progress, that we do have some evidence-based interventions that will work. And so one of the things we emphasize both in the book and in the documentary is what's called home visitation programs, which basically work with at-risk parents and at-risk kids very early in life, beginning in pregnancy up to the first few years of life. And it's to encourage pregnant women to try to avoid alcohol, try to avoid drugs. After the birth, think about, if you want birth control, then, here's how you might go about getting it for a next child. Encourage breastfeeding, encourage talking to a child. Third, a child on welfare will have heard 30 million fewer words by age 4 than a child to professionals, 30 million more words. And, so they begin to speak at the same time, but because of that gap, that child on welfare is going to be less prepared for school. The verbal parts of the child's brain are going to be less developed. It's a huge impediment. And so there are these home visitation programs that kind of coach these parents on these elements of early childhood rearing. And the result is that even though they end at, one that was studied most ends at age 2, by age 15, those kids are only half as likely to have been arrested. And because juvenile incarceration is incredibly expensive, $110,000 a year, this program, every dollar invested in it, pays for itself 7 times over. And so we would not only be doing a huge benefit to these kids and to these moms, we would be saving public money on a major scale. And yet this program, it's called Nurse-Family Partnership, it still only reaches about 2% of the kids who need it in the U.S. And that's another example where poverty is indeed, in some sense, about personal irresponsibility, but that irresponsibility, in part, is that of society and not actually implementing evidence-based programs that would make a real difference and would pay for themselves multiple times over.
And just to add on that, because I'm big on the early intervention part also, is that, you know, a lot of the issues that we talk about both in Half the Sky and A Path Appears, sex trafficking, domestic violence, teenage pregnancy, we tend to think about them as very discrete issues that, okay, let's just talk about domestic violence right now. Let's just talk about this. But actually, if you really think about where these women and men and kids come from and what their backgrounds are, there are so many similarities, and a lot of them have to do with what if you could intervene a little earlier? What if you can remove some of the vulnerability that they're facing as a young child? What if the moms, when they're having the babies, know how to raise their babies or give them a better shot at both medical care or education? I think it has an impact on all of these different things that we are talking about and are worried about. So we should invest earlier.
Great. Well, before, I want to make sure we have time to open it up to Q&A. Before we do that, I just wanted to ask, you know, can you share with us what's the secret to sort of maintaining the optimism and looking at, you know, any sort of secrets that when you read or watch the film, you can see that with all of the different advocates, and you can see it even in the trailer as well, some of those happy moments as well.
You know, people always sort of think, because I spend a lot of time covering genocide and poverty and sex trafficking, that I must be kind of deeply depressed and greatly traumatized and very fragile. And the truth is that, sure, in reporting these things, you see some really terrible things, but side by side with the worst of humanity, you typically see the very best. You see incredible courage, incredible resilience. You see people who are making a difference and empowering people, providing opportunity. And you also see an element of progress. When I first, and I think this maybe is, you know, something that we in the journalism need to figure out better how to tell the story of. When I first began traveling around Africa as a backpacking law student, what really struck me was the blindness. And there were so many middle-aged people who, from river blindness, cataracts, trachoma, could not see, could not work, could not look after their kids. And we, for the book, we talked to a woman in Mali who had trachoma, which is an incredibly painful way to go blind, for 8 years, had lost 2 kids because she couldn't raise food for them. And then she got a $40 surgery through Helen Keller International, which is right here in New York, $40 surgery from a nurse, 20-minute operation. And then they're helping her up off the table and says, oh, you know, are you okay? Do you want us to walk you back to your home? She says, get out of my way. I can see now. I can look after myself. You know, $40. I mean, that's not depressing. That's inspiring what we can do. And on the whole, that is happening. It's just not happening fast enough.
Great. I'd love to open it up to the audience to ask a couple questions. The mics are on both sides.
Thank you guys both for being here. Incredibly inspiring work. I watched the first installment last Tuesday, streaming on PBS. I Chromecasted it to my TV. So I actually, Nick, I come from the New York Times. My background is on the business side at the New York Times, and I've been at Google for 3 years now. Still,
you got a better business model here.
Well, yeah, a developing business model at the New York Times as well. But being at Google, we know a lot about the laws of supply and demand, understanding that, where the demand is, the supply will flow. You talk a lot about that. I'm excited to read this book and kind of look at it from a hopeful perspective of what we can do across a myriad of different intervention techniques, one of which is the kind of early childhood intervention. But what struck me as different in the first installment was the focus on the Johns, right? This idea that if you focus on the demand side, that is a nice way to kind of circumvent what you've been doing for years and years and years, which hasn't worked clearly, which is focusing on the supply side. What did you see in your travels and work around this book and then the documentary that gives you hope that is actually a nice way to kind of buttress out the work that's been done for years by law enforcement by focusing on the demand side? And are you hopeful that that's a innovation that may be helpful in stemming the tide of the trafficking trend in the U.S. and abroad?
It's a great question, and indeed, I think that focusing on the demand side is, there's no silver bullet here, but there's silver buckshot, and that's one of the elements of silver buckshot that can make a difference on trafficking. I'm generally a believer that ending impunity for problems is hugely important. One of the things that isn't much realized is that there has actually been, over the last generation, huge progress in the U.S. on both domestic violence and rape, as best we can measure them. And the numbers are problematic, but using victimization surveys, it looks as if both of them have fallen by more than 50% over the last generation. And why is that? A generation ago, there was 100% impunity. A husband could completely beat up his wife, boyfriend completely beat up his girlfriend. The police just would not intervene. And most rapes are people who know each other. It's a boyfriend-girlfriend situation or former boyfriend, whatever it may be. And again, there in that situation was almost complete impunity. Now, we know that there is still a lot of impunity in that situation. But now there are enough guys who, even though they've drunk too much, when this girl says, no, stop here, something still goes on in their brain. They think there might be a risk. And that's why those victimization rates have gone down. In the case of trafficking, about 300,000, again, we don't have good numbers, but a rough estimate is about 300,000 men will buy sex today somewhere in the U.S. Virtually none of them will be arrested. You're more likely to be hit by lightning than you are to be arrested while buying sex. So there is essentially no risk to you. A lot of those men have a lot to lose if they were arrested for buying sex. They have reputations. It would be a very bad thing. If there were just a 1 or 2% risk that they might actually be arrested, I think they wouldn't buy sex. And I think you would, in that case, see a significant drop in demand. And in that case, there would be fewer women trafficked. And going after Johns is actually pretty easy. We have a segment in the doc where we essentially, the police department posts an ad on Backpage and books a hotel room, and guys show up and show up and show up and show up, and you arrest them as they come. And then, it's pretty basic stuff. And I think that wouldn't solve the problem. Boy, I think it would make a difference.
I just want to add also, so that was in Cook County, Chicago, and they've done a lot in terms of trafficking and also working with survivor groups, and they just finished another Johns Day. So there are numbers available. And I will also say it's a lot about what we all think about Johns and whether or not we think prostitution is okay or not. I mean, I've been to John schools now where people walk out, or the Johns walk out, and they just had no idea that A, it was dangerous, or B, that's the backgrounds of some of the women that they're engaging in prostitution with. And I will say, something that I love is there are certain district attorneys' offices that will post the pictures of the Johns that are arrested because it's public record. And it's part of that idea that if you just, it's a shameful thing. So if we, as a society, understand that idea, it'll make a dent.
Hi, thank you for coming in. You talked about early intervention, and I was just wondering if you had any comments about parental leave in this country as comparison with other places and how that might have an effect on early intervention.
We don't have good research on that. It makes sense that parental leave would help. Maternal attachment, there was one study that found that maternal attachment at 18 months to a child was a better predictor of high school graduation than IQ was. So there's pretty good evidence that there is a correlation. It would make sense that a mom or a dad who who is going to be around is going to be more likely to have that kind of attachment. But we don't have, to my knowledge, rigorous evidence on that. What we do know is that access to parental leave seems to leave working class moms more likely to stay in the labor force, which is a good way of fighting poverty. I mean, a job, I don't quote President Reagan very much, but one thing he was right on is that the best social program is a job. And I think there's been a misperception that things like parental leave will reduce employment. And in fact, the best evidence from Europe, for example, is that they actually boost employment, and likewise things like paid sick leave, this kind of thing, that they actually boost employment by making employment more compatible with parenthood, and especially single parenthood.
Hi, my name is Carly. I haven't read the book, but I did read Half the Sky, and I found it incredibly inspiring years ago. My question is about, when you say early intervention, I don't know if there's any research on the foster care system, specifically in New York City. Do you find that a lot of children who get caught up in the trafficking are runaways, or perhaps in foster care that is inadequate? Just curious how that plays a role in the equation.
Oh, it's huge, absolutely. I mean, a lot of the organizations that we feature in the series deal specifically with foster care kids or throwaways or runaways, because those are definitely the most vulnerable demographic, because they don't have the guidance or the mentorship or the confidence, really, to be able to know what to do in a situation when they're approached by someone. Runaways in particular, I mean, if you're on the street, you don't have any money, you don't have any place to go to, and it is a dangerous, dangerous world out there, because there are a lot of people that know how easy it is to sell other people.
Thank you.
Do you want to say anything about that?
One of the programs that has a really good record, and it's been done with randomized control trials, really a kind of evidence-based attempt, is called Youth Villages. And what it does is, because often foster parent success rates aren't great and institutional rates aren't great, that what they do is try to provide strong support to that child's family, or if the mom and dad aren't appropriate or in jail or whatever, then to find some other relative who may be willing to take that child in so that it's at least part of the extended family, and then provide them support and coaching to make it more feasible. And that has worked much better. There does seem to be this yearning for family ties, and it's now being introduced by more and more states because it saves money, again, because then they're spending less money on these juvenile detention centers, which are incredibly expensive. But the outcomes are also better for these kind of extended family-based programs.
Hi, my name is Bianca Levy. I'm a fan of yours and Cheryl's work. My question is about the Super Bowl. It's one of the most dangerous times of year in terms of sex trafficking, yet there seems to be very little awareness about it. So what do we know about human trafficking around the Super Bowl, and what preventative measures are being done or do you think should be done to prevent this?
There's actually something of a debate about this, and the conventional wisdom has been that there's a lot of trafficking, that Super Bowl tends to be a hub for trafficking, and it makes intuitive sense, but there have been some studies of trying to look at ads for sex on Backpage.com in the cities where the Super Bowl is being held, and I think I've come across 3 different studies of this, and they come to somewhat mixed results, but they don't seem to suggest that it is nearly as much of a hub for trafficking as kind of the conventional wisdom is. And I don't know enough about the underlying reasons for that. It is true that generally convention cities tend to be a time when people go online and and by 10% of American men in one survey had purchased sex online in the previous year. I mean, it's a huge, huge, huge thing. But that connection with the Super Bowl, at least to me, is still somewhat elusive.
Hi there. Thanks for being here. My name's Eleanor, and as a avid Law and Order fan, I'm curious about how we can use and leverage popularized media, be it like movies or television, to educate America and elsewhere about these very pressing issues around domestic violence, around sex trafficking and rape. I'm curious if you've done work with that before, or what your thoughts on are leveraging media as a way to shift the mindset, where maybe law and policy might be slower to do so.
I'm a huge believer in exactly what you're saying, and I come to this reluctantly because I have a scribbler's kind of disdain for TV. Oh, we're above that, and yet then I came across a pretty amazing study, or a pair of studies, one in Brazil, one in India. And I've always really believed that girls' education is the way you really transform a society. Just, that is the incredible elixir of changing minds. And then there was one study in India that looked at what happens when television arrives in a rural village for the first time, and the change in attitudes in that village. And it found that 6 months of television in a village is equivalent to, I forget, 4 years of education or something, in terms of attitudes towards domestic violence, towards whether a woman should be able to leave the house without her husband's permission, this kind of thing. And it seemed to be that people had very traditional attitudes in these villages, and then these TV shows essentially showed middle-class urban families where the woman was educated, where she was not getting beaten up, where she was leaving the house, and that, because it was kind of high-status families, that tended to, villagers kind of respected it. And something similar in Brazil. And then here in this country, one of the things that has particularly vexed me is the problem with teen pregnancy. About 30% of American teenage girls become pregnant by age 19. 30%. And that is down now 51% since the modern peak in 1991. Well, what brought it down from that modern peak? One of the factors was 16 and Pregnant, the TV show, by essentially showing teenage girls, this is what pregnancy and being a mom is like. I can't say I watched the show, but I gather that was the takeaway. And so I love my perch on the op-ed page of the New York Times, but I do think that people who come up with plot lines on some of these shows in ways that aren't didactic and aren't heavy-handed, but maybe can send a message. And Neil Baer has done this incredibly well with some of his TV shows. I think that may be a really powerful way to open minds and hearts.
Thank you.
We've got time for one more question.
So you said at the beginning of the trailer how poverty is at the root of all of this. Can you explain more about how poverty plays a role?
I can start with the idea that one thing that we kept trying to kind of unveil is the idea that poverty is not just a financial or dollar kind of idea. It's really kind of a vicious cycle that is difficult to get out of, whether you're in Colombia or you're in West Virginia. And so you've known this for a long time, you've been telling these stories, but as we were filming and actually collecting these stories, you just heard the same patterns over and over again. Whether our story was trafficking or whether our story was domestic violence, there were similarities in terms of how poverty and the lack of opportunity contributed to that kind of vulnerability that led to certain abuses.
Yeah, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, we met a family. The girl, it was a small girl. Her mom was 13 when she'd had her. Her mom, the grandmother, was 14 when she had her. The great-grandmother was 13 when she'd had her. You'd had this cycle. And when you have babies having babies, then that's not good for either the mom or for the child. It's more likely to lead to a lack of maternal attachment in childhood, to the child hearing fewer of these words being spoken, less talking, to nutrition issues, to sometimes self-medication. In West Virginia, 20% of kids now are born with alcohol or narcotics in their system. 20%. And those kids, they're not at the starting line. And then people, partly because they self-medicate, they get an arrest. And then once you have a criminal record, you become even less employable. You get then, one thing that conservatives were essentially right about and liberals wrong about over the last generation or two was the importance of families for raising kids. There was evidence that boys in particular really matters if a dad is at home. And I think conservatives were right on that. They were absolutely wrong about mass incarceration. Mass incarceration, by quintupling the number of people behind bars, we dramatically reduced the number of dads at home. And so you have all these issues swirling around that make it a lot harder for these kids. And it's not exactly poverty in the sense of low income, but it's poverty in this broader sense of just not seeing a trajectory out, not getting the support, not having that sort of economic and social mobility and access to education that is the best escalator out of poverty.
I know that the focus on that is also something that will be airing tonight and a big part of tonight's episode. So I encourage everybody to watch tonight and also next Monday at 10 p.m. on PBS. Thank you so much, Nicholas and Mira. There are books that Nicholas signed in the back as well if you're interested. But thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having us. Appreciate it.